there is currently a lack of empirical studies linking evaluator competencies to useful or sound evaluations. So without that link, how can we say, well, if you have these 6 competencies, you will produce a useful and good evaluation? So, being aware of that, the field is moving forward. So why do we need competencies, despite this lack of empirical evidence, which I'm sure will come in the near future? First of all, evaluation requires unique knowledge and skills, right? As I always say, first you're a researcher, then you're an evaluator. It's a whole bunch of skills that come on top of being a researcher. And it's my own personal soapbox. And here I'll take off my researcher cap for a moment and put on my evaluator cap, where I can use some values more. One of the things I often do when I meet people and they introduce themselves as an evaluator, I always say, well, what's your favorite evaluation theory? I mean, evaluation is about valuing, so what theories guide you when you use value in your evaluations? And most of the time, people cannot answer that question. And I find that very scary. Because if you're an evaluator, you're doing evaluations, and you don't know what explicit values you're using to make those value judgments, what are you using? Now I'm going to take that cap off and become a researcher again and talk a little more empirically. So does it matter who develops your evaluator competency? Yeah, it really does matter. And I'm just going to show a very short example here why that might matter. And first I'm going to talk about myself. Okay, I'm talking this topic today, as you know, is about evaluator competencies in Africa. Okay, first, I'm white. Yes, I am. And I'm also a USA citizen. I was born in the US. So what right do I have to even research this topic? Firstly, and you might say I don't after you hear this list, but here's my justification. I've been a practicing evaluator for 20 years, most of which have been in Africa and Asia. 17 of those. I'm a resident of South Africa, and I've spent a considerable amount of time conducting evaluations in 15 countries. And if any of you follow the AEA Evaluator Leaders Forum, Tessie led this great discussion on, unfortunately I was traveling at the time, but this great discussion on this whole issue of flying evaluators in for a week, doing evaluation and flying them out. Okay? So I didn't include those countries where I do fly in and fly out. I'm a past AfrEA board member, and when I was on the board, I spent the majority of my time focusing on getting a discussion around evaluator competencies, which ended up in a nice international forum. We had people coming in, it was an open forum, to talk about what are we going to do about these competencies. And this was back in 2010. Some of those presenters are sitting in this room. I also led the development of the draft standard, evaluation standards and competencies for the South African government. That was a huge eye-opening experience for me, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And I also have some authors in here as well that collaborated with me on a journal for the Canadians that was trying to take a global perspective on competencies around the world and looking at how different countries have gone about creating their lists. So I have somewhat of a research background in this, so this is my justification for moving forward, besides my passion. So I wanted to just take a look at 3 different people who have very different opinions on what it means to be a competent evaluator. And here I am being an academic, so I'm going to show you some of the lists. You can read them. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Michael Patel. If you're not, please become familiar with him. He has a lot of books out there, and if you know Michael, he has a very practitioner's approach toward being an evaluator, despite being an academic himself. And if you look at the list that he comes up with, you'll notice the 4th one down, consulting skills, or the ones I put in green, programming logic capabilities, knowledge of how organizations work, all right? So it's not just a focus on being a researcher for Michael, but you have to understand organizational development. And I love creativity, right, which other people have also said, such as Robert Staten. Okay, and verbal and written presentation skills, communication skills come up with a lot on the list. But Michael's very specific about presentation skills, which we do at these conferences. And that was back in 1990. So that's Michael Patel. Now we're going to take a look at Michael Scriven, who I'm also sure you're very familiar with. who has a very different worldview and has a very different paradigm in which he operates. And he comes up with a very different list of what a competent evaluator should look like. And here you're looking at meta-analysis, ethical, generalizability theory, cost analysis, conceptual geography. I don't know what that means, so I'm not confident in his list. But you can see how these two lists, they vary quite a bit. These are both coming from white male Western thinkers, which I think is also good to know. And also I pulled up Donna Merton's list. It wasn't as specific as the other lists, but those of you who don't know, Donna Mertens is also a white female Western theorist who's based at Gallaudet University, which is a university for the deaf in the United States. She's mostly known for her writing in feminist evaluation and transformative theory, which I use quite a bit. But here's her 4 ideas of what you need to be a competent evaluator. She says those unique to evaluation, and that, she defines that. Those associated with typical training in methodology. Here she's talking about qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, and so on. Areas that are related to political science or anthropology. Now, she's really one of the first list makers, or people that have actually written on this, that acknowledges the very useful approaches that anthropology brings in for us to use. And most people are more focused on social science, psychology, that's where a lot of people in our field have actually come from. And those that are discipline specific, so she's talking about education, agriculture, and so on. You can see these 3 lists, they're very different. They're from very different people, but certainly 3 people that are very highly regarded in the field of evaluation. I regard very highly. So what can we base our model? Where do we start in Africa if we're talking about competencies for us? Well, who's doing it? That's one place that I started looking at. And I'm not going to go through all of this because I'm going to refer you to an online journal that is free and has just come out this month, so very relevant. But AfrEA has done it, and they're here, and they're one of the ones I'm summarizing, and now I'm really nervous that I don't get it wrong. Ideas, UNAIDS is very unique because we also have someone here that's worked on them, so again, nerve-wracking. But UNAIDS is one of the ones who has taken it as a sector-specific competency. So if you're going to be an evaluator that's doing evaluation for HIV and AIDS, what do you need to know? It's a very useful list. Canada, which you're probably most familiar with if you follow this field, as you know, they've moved to a credentialing system. Japanese Evaluation Society, I cannot find anything on that in English, but I've spoken to one of the guys who created that, who's also one of my graduate cohorts, in my graduate cohort. And they've actually moved towards certification, where they actually take an exam. And if they get somebody right, they become an official evaluator. And they've got 3 categories for that type of evaluator. In South Africa, as I mentioned, the South African government, not SEMEA, has come up with different competencies for evaluators who work with government. And as I noted, I was the lead researcher and developer of those. And as much as I think they're useful insofar as if you work with governments. We're very focused on that. EES has started a whole process. If you're on the listservs, you've probably seen some information going out about that. I'm very excited to see how they develop theirs and where that goes. And there's many others. I have 5 minutes. Okay, so faster. One of the only empirical work that is out there was done by Jean King, Maurice Devon, and a group of others. And what they ended up showing us was that they have these categories of what you need to have to be a competent evaluator. In total, I think there's something like 61 very specific descriptions, which are under each of these different categories. And they're not saying that you need all 61 to be competent, okay? But what they're giving basically is a guideline of if you're going to study to be an evaluator, if you want to improve your evaluation skills, it's kind of a guide of what you can do to continue moving forward in the profession. The Canadian Evaluation those are developed in the United States, and then the Canadian Evaluation Association used those to help develop their competency set and their credentialing. DegEval, they also have competencies out that were originally posted in 2008. I don't know if they've updated them. I haven't found any updates. And they talk about these areas, and I thought was very interesting was they're the only ones that mentioned the theory and history of evaluation, which, as you know, I'm big on. So I was very excited to see that. They consider this to be a competency area. You can see they also touch on organizational skills. On AfrEA, they have 4 different areas that they look at: contextual analysis, systematic and evaluative inquiry, project management, and reflective practice. I'm not just saying this because she's here. These happen to be some of my favorite competencies that have come up, and a lot is because they're so explicit about their value base. They place valuing culture and cultural values at the very heart of their framework. So I find that to be both applicable because of the evaluation and also very explicit of how they ended up developing these competencies. There were 2 major focuses that helped them develop, and I've just developed these, and there's just one I put up here, and you can speak more about this, and I don't even know if I pronounced this right, but it's a commitment to the Treaty of okay, which embraces the principles of the treaty: partnership, protection, and participation. So if you look at their competencies, you can see this throughout them all. Other competency sets, they don't do that. It's not very clear where those values are coming from. The RSA government ones, all of us developed this into 3 different role players. We looked at the role of program managers and the advisors and the evaluators themselves. Sometimes those roles overlap. And we looked at 4 different domains, and then each domain is broken into between 10 and 15 specific criteria. And then we moved further on, and what we said is, well, everybody needs to have knowledge of methods. But the evaluators would need this level, and the ME advisors would need this level, and the program managers this level. So we divided it up into levels of knowledge.
This is the South African government.
This is the South African government, yeah. Republic of South Africa. So this was not an exhaustive list, and I think I've got like 2 minutes left. But I did put the slide up here. It's a free journal, and it goes into a nice description of how all of these different countries develop their competencies and references to where you can find their lists. And some criticisms as well, which was done by Andy Rowe. So should we have competencies for African or for different African countries? And my response is yes, and I feel very strongly about that. Why do I feel that way? Because I think we need to determine who is and who is not an evaluator. But we need to keep the charlatans out, okay? And I feel strongly about that. To provide an objective way for people to select evaluators. Donors, governments are constantly saying, well, how do we know we've got the right evaluator? How do we select someone? How do we know they're good? And the very first thing I say is, just because someone is a member of an evaluation association does not make them an evaluator. Because I do see that cropping up as a criteria for some governments and some donors. And finally, which I think is a big thing, especially as an academic, is to guide learning. How do we develop our master's degree programs or our continuing education programs without having an understanding of what we should be teaching people or offering people? So I think there's many reasons to develop them. Okay, but I also sit on the fence. And sometimes I think, well, it could also be a really bad idea. And here I steal an idea. That wasn't my bell, right? I steal an idea from the Brits because I kind of say what I'm trying to say much better than I can. Some fear that it might be a stranglehold on what evaluators can do. It does not cover everything. And it might provide commissioners and managers with an inflexible list. Okay? So do I think African competencies would be unique? I do. And one of the reasons I think we would have competencies that are unique to other places, and this is early on in the research, is I think we have so many different role players that call themselves evaluators. We have people that only do monitoring. I'm an M&E officer. I say, what do? They say, I look at numbers every month, right? Which is a useful job, but I wouldn't call them an evaluator. We have people who focus on a lot of program design, theory of change, program activities, and so on and so forth. In America, in the United States, they're basically arguing, the Scriven at Claremont School, they're saying theory of change work is not a part of an evaluator's job. Right? I would say it is, but the third one, there's people I know that only do pure evaluation. They come in, they do impact design, they do an implementation design, they carry it out, they make their judgments. Hopefully they have a reason to provide values for that, and they leave. Right? But they don't do period of change in program development. There's people who combine number 2 and 3, and then there's people that you manage and use evaluation. So I think we need to think about competencies for these different groups. And there's some other ones I have as well, because I can't do this. I think, particularly when we're working in our context, we need to have knowledge of donor and enemy frameworks. If I'm helping an organization and DFID is their donor, I would design something very different than if CETA were their donor, okay, or IRGC or USAID. And I need to know that. I need to know what they accept as indicators. We often work in within multiple cultures at the same time. And you've got 5 donors, and you've got the government, the local community, and so on and so forth, and your own organizational cultures. I think we do need to know how to facilitate a theory of change. And we also need to have a knowledge of donors' evaluation approaches. If I'm asked to do an impact evaluation for DFID, or I'm asked to do an impact evaluation for IRC, I'm going to design a very different approach, right? Often we're working with multiple and often conflicting reporting needs. Indicator data needs to be reported January 1st, no, actually March, no, is it July? But everyone wants the same indicator with the same target at 3 different time periods. We need to know how to help projects work with that, okay? Cultural competencies specific to African countries or particular regions that you're working in or locales. Okay. So the last question I have is, how should this move forward, if at all? And I think these are some of the key questions I would want to put forth to the room. What problems or competencies intended to address? Do we think that credentialing would ensure competency? Who benefits and who loses? Because someone's going to benefit if we have competency. Someone's going to lose. Someone's going to get hurt. Should competencies be developed for all of Africa in general and then modified by country? Or developed by individual countries, universities, associations, clear AA? Who should lead this initiative, and who are we going to get to fund it? Donors. Or in the room. But my last statement, which worries me the most, is who has the power to define who is and who is not an evaluator?
Thank you, Donna. We overran slightly, but I think she gave us 2 presentations on the price of 1, and she might even rephrase it where who is and who is not an African evaluator. So, to be fair to all the presenters, we will take the same procedure. It's a fascinating topic. We'll have a conference on this, but if there are 2 or 3 really burning comments or clarifications or additions you'd like to make, we'll take those. Donna can respond in 30 seconds to that, and then we'll move on to the next presenter. So we have 3 hands going up. We'll take 1 over here, starting there. We'll take 1 there, 1 there. So it's okay. We have it can be brief until 1.
Donna, thank you for the presentation, and thanks for the work. The journal that's just up, I think, is a good place to start to get a good growth where you're going with it. I've been on the fence about whether we should potential whatever. I'm on the fence. But another idea of moving people towards better quality evaluations is to introduce the idea of continuous professional development, and not just. And there are other mechanisms that we can use to do that might not be as exclusive. Make sure that people are accredited or can submit credits for attending workshops, conferences, possibly doing the reading that's then assessed by a small little test, which probably will not just exclude people, but will bring people into this business of continually learning, which I think is a more valuable concept than one-off credentialing. That's my faith.
That's a good opinion.
Okay, we had 3 hands already. Tessa, Bernd, and now we have a 4th hand. We'll have a general discussion at the end. So this is now really clarification of point you really want to make to Donna. So is that you really want to make to Donna? Okay.
So it feels that this discussion is combining the question of credentialing in terms of becoming a profession, which is really important to us, and who's a good evaluator. Just because you're a doctor doesn't mean you're a good doctor. There are lots of doctors who make a lot of mistakes, and that's one of the most highly credentialed field. So it seems to me that I would like to sort of separate out some of these questions, and so that we're not confusing the two, because it kind of, the confusing the two becomes a block to the discussion about credentialing.
So the question is about, sorry, to clarify, the question really is about what are the competency sets? Yes.
Okay, but quick to the point.
Thank you for a very stimulating presentation. I think we need a frame of reference for this. I think it's starting where I see too much in a lot of these competency studies techniques, and start from the other end. We teach the evaluators using an outcome approach. We should do the same ourselves. And evaluation is a practical enterprise. It's supposed to result in use. And what would enable that? Start with that. Discussing now in an African context rather than start with the statement of use. Too much of a tendency to say that as a good researcher just do that. And this side of the purpose of evaluation.
Thank you so much. And the fourth one over there. Okay, so.
Yeah, Tricia from the MasterCard Foundation. I just wanted to ask, maybe, I didn't see much in your presentation about technical knowledge about particular subject matter expertise or those sort of things. Perhaps if you could clarify how that's been approached in the credentialing work you've done.
Yes, I'm actually going to unfortunately just refer you to the journal because there's 6 different ways that people have dealt with that, and they absolutely have, and not everyone agrees.
Yeah.
And I'm on the fence. So.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, we have one very last point. Okay, please go ahead.
I'll just be worried in the conversation before we hear about
Sorry?
I was worried in the conversation. We are talking about competencies for African evaluators. I'm just a bit worried if the conversation ends, and probably there's another opportunity. The conversation ends without hearing from Africans.
Okay. Hear from that. Can we come back at the general discussion? Yes. Okay. Point well taken. We want the voice of everyone in the audience and those from the continent who are practicing in the continent, who are nationals of the continent.
At least one comment from someone who volunteered to respond.
Okay. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
I just want to say Africa spoke.
Introduction.
My name is Adam Suleiman. I'm from Nigeria. Yeah. So Africa spoke. Benita is fully. And maybe let's add for flags, right?
Yeah, let's
She's from here. She spoke. I think what we wanted is some kind of real discussions over this. And maybe you say later there's room for that. Because there's a lot. This is a good starting point. There's a lot we can talk about around this, and this may start a better discussion that will be taken forward by folks, by other development partners, and many people with interest. I think this is something that has come out from somewhere, and it's going to add value to the process of what we're bringing out as a guide that line for evaluation. Just going to be able to do that. I just want one thing that I can see here. One of the useful ways to improve this, I think, is to try to divide competency or competence from competencies, because these are 2 different areas that I think, if clearly divided, will set a structural thinking around the kind of things we think about evaluators.
I refer you to the journal, which we just did, which has a great discussion on that, so thank you.
I think, thank you for the comment. I think that we're obviously in a problem, and as with every conference, you have an hour and a half and all these very interesting and very important things. So I think in your comments afterwards in the general discussion, don't come in with a lot of extra detail, a lot of extra nuances, but really come in with practical proposals then as to how to carry it forward, either at the VOBI level or at the peer level or anywhere else, because I think that's the purpose of this session, is to carry the discussion forward and to find ways and spaces to do that, because the time allocated to us now is going to be inevitably inadequate for the topic. So let's try and be inspired by these presentations and find ways of moving forward. And I'm sure that some of you here in the audience are already managing fora or doing things which would really contribute to a further development of this. So the next presenter, who's ready to go now? Is it you, Donna? I think Matt Mahesh said he's flexible. Have you loaded yours now?
Yes, I've looked at it.
Okay, then fine. Well, maybe then, if you're ready to go, we'll take and Taba, who's from South Africa, and
Don't
is
you want to go with Mohammed because it's more or less the same?
okay. Mahesh, if you're all set, is yours?
Yeah, I'm all set. It is slightly linked to the last presentation in some ways. So,
If you're loaded up, I'm sorry, I thought that you. Okay. So Mahesh Patel, former founding chair of an African Evaluation Association, and is making a presentation on the standards. And so I think we would. Mahesh is a voice of history in some ways in some of these discussions, and has been part of this process since the 1990s. So since the last century. So he is the voice of the last century and this century. So.
you know, if you reel out the first president of the AfrEA for something like this, you're going to expect a little bit of history. So this is the bag from the first AfrEA conference. Still have it. I'm using it as the introductory slide for this thing, because there's actually quite a bit of history that's going on behind this. The first work in Africa on this was a training that we did in Nairobi, the Nairobi M&E Network in 1998. And we had 3 sessions on the evaluation standards because we were really concerned about quality of evaluation work in Africa and how to improve it and everything like that. And then by the time the first AfrEA came around in 1999, we had a sort of rough draft of some of the changes that we thought should be put in there. But after the first AfrEA, which was sort of led by, I guess, the 6 national evaluation associations, were the heads of those groups, who was sort of governing board, which incidentally met in French, because 4 out of the 6 were francophone. We decided to really work through it. So as the number of associations increased, we had at various times between 10 and 14 national groups looking at the standards and sending comments. And at least the core 10, every single one of them had a meeting to go through the American version of the program evaluation standards and send in their comments and what they thought should be modified. So just going through it very briefly, that was the list. What are the African evaluation guidelines? Well, they're based on the American program evaluation standards, which is a checklist of about 30 items, and some of those items we thought were inappropriate for Africa. So we made a sort of a committee. We had a draft working group. The draft was revised after the 1999 session, and they requested field testing. So we field tested in a number of countries. Our revised version with sort of adaptations for Africa. AfrEA did a wonderful piece of work where 60 stakeholders were invited to a room and worked through the checklist, and all of them answered, and all the responses were collated, and that was given back to the university team to improve which included 4 prominent university professors in AfrEA, to improve their evaluation work. But then in 2002, AfrEA adapted it as a working document to be used, and improved as we go along. But then it's kind of had a little, and it was published in 2002 as well in the Journal of Evaluation Program Planning. It has actually been republished, but in its, a different written form in the current African Evaluation Journal. I think it's the most substantial article there. The structure of the African Evaluation Guidelines, same as the American Program Evaluation Standards, is 4 chapters. One on the usefulness of the evaluation, one on its feasibility, one on its proprietary, sort of more ethical kinds of things, and another one about its accuracy. And each one of these contains several specific criteria. And what we did was revise specific criteria. So there was, the 4th one is on values identification, as Donna has just been talking about, and we had some changes which we put in italic text. And that was, in this case, it was the possibility of preserving multiple interpretations of the findings in a transparent way, so that we can recognize that different stakeholders see things in a different way, not just triangulate and say that this is the correct one. Report time use and dissemination. What we found in practice was that it was not possible to do an evaluation in some of the African countries in the same way as you might do one in Switzerland, where everything appeared on the minute. It's 11:01, that's the time for the evaluation. evaluation presentation of the final results. There are various sorts of logistic difficulties, seasonal difficulties, things paused and stuff like that. So that it just, timeliness was an issue, and also that the feedback was also an issue. The power of the donor over the evaluator in Africa was considered to be much greater than in perhaps some other environments. And there is also the very acute consideration that there's very different governments in Africa allow different levels of freedom of expression. And so there were a number of adaptations on protection of the evaluators. So political viability has this as well. It's again linked to the protection of the evaluators. And you'll see that this came up as a recurrent theme from the commentators from the countries who were commenting on it. I have to say that in some countries people were saying, we don't need to worry about this. It's free, we shouldn't have a restriction here. Whereas other countries people were saying, we cannot survive without a clear statement that, government may decide what it is we're going to say. So we went for the more cautious end of the scale. Again, formal agreements, very often the contractor or the contractee are coming from very different cultures. And there's this US culture of you set everything down and it's a contract and then you do it according to those specifications. But even those contracts carry with them a lot of implicit ideas about what a proper evaluation is going to look like, whereas our own evaluators often feel that they have a different, feel that they have a different image of what an evaluation should look like. So one aspect is to spell out as much as possible, in writing and especially through dialogue, because sometimes writing is just very small print and nobody reads it, but also through dialogue to really clarify what is needed, but also to pay, special attention there towards the informal and implicit aspects. And we were finding in agencies very often that there were two quite different views of what the work entailed. And so it was in an attempt to improve that situation. There we have, again, the political viability. You should anticipate that there will be different interest groups with different perspectives on these things. And there again, that what the evaluator does has to be adjusted according to the feasibility of the situation. This can include, I've had people in the field getting shot at. It can include some rather extreme circumstances, and the safety of the evaluators does matter. So, formal agreement. I might skip going back over the same slide. Okay, I think I'm pressing it down. Okay, so human interaction. That evaluators should respect human dignity. Again, this is a complex issue when evaluators may be coming in from different cultures from the group that they're evaluating. And this applies not just to people coming from the US or North America. This actually applies within the same country in Africa. I mean, there's very often different cultures within the same country. And people within the same country may not be familiar with the culture of a minority group in that country. So these sorts of issues are really important. Disclosure of findings. This is, again, this whole thing about exposing evaluators to potential harm was one that we have come up again, time and time again when I was based in Africa. So it was very real to our evaluators in their minds as well. We had quite a strong degree of unanimity on this. And here again, it's the different forms of communication where, if you're coming from a tradition where a lot of communication is verbal and not necessarily very much written down, whereas, those formal contracts are used, legal contracts are used relatively rarely. It's very important to emphasize the personal and verbal communication of what it is we expect to have done. The context analysis, we added including social, political, cultural, environmental aspects, because it was felt that these were often being left out. Validity of information. we actually felt that information is actually almost normally biased. In some people took, people got different extremes, the cases in. But there again, if information that may be biased should be checked using a range of methods. And clearly where there are different interest groups that may be in conflict with each other involved, then it's very important to do the modification. So what was changed and why? Out of the 30, 13 have been changed, and that the political and cultural considerations were the major driving forces for the changes. The guidelines on political viability and disclosure of findings were considered politically sensitive in some African countries, not all. So they could, those are probably ones that could be adjusted according to the degree of freedom in different countries. So the final wording was a compromise between the needs of different groups. Cultural considerations came up several times. And there again, we looked, there was permissive male-female interactions, for example, and then one on stakeholder identification as well. Language was a big issue. The guidelines were actually translated into French and Burundi, but I think we've lost track of that. Well, I have lost track of that translation. Many years ago, this was back in 2003. But there should be some kind of academic translation. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mahesh has given us an extra 5 minutes, so we will take a few comments. Can we see some hands going up here? Okay, I'll take 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, then we'll do it. Okay. Close.
Thank you, Mahesh. My question is actually to those participants that are members of the American Evaluation Association of Intensive. And the reason I'm directing it to her, to you, is how have these standards been used? How are we expected to use them? When, by whom, and how?
Thank you. Do you want to take note of the
So
question?
should I take a few?
Yeah, we'll take 2 or 3 and then you respond. That's okay.
My name is Guido Kuhse. I have the same question, so about the usage of these standards, and also who's taking up these standards?
Who is what?
Who's taking up these standards? Who's applying these standards?
Okay, same question. Okay, Islamic Development Bank.
Yes, my question is this, this actually have to be ratified by the government, because if the government would like, for instance, use the evaluation, they have to look into it, they have to take it, they have to adopt it as it. And the other thing also, are they binding for the regional states, regional association, if there is an association, say, guards, they have to take it, the whole, or they can also adopt and take whatever they think that's.
Do you want to, can I take those 3?
Yeah, they're related. Take those 3 and then we'll get to it down here.
As it was. Florence, we field tested this in 8 countries originally. I described the one in Eritrea, but there were several others that were also interesting and had a new kind of methodology attached to them. For the 2002 issue of evaluation program planning, we had 14 African evaluations on HIV/AIDS programs, all of which were rated by the program evaluation standards, and that complete rating table was published in the same journal. So the rating of every single evaluation according to the program evaluation standards actually constituted the first article in the journal. So we thought that was good practice. It was not continued. There was one other thing I wanted to say. I will come back to it if I remember. Peter, who's applying those? I think organizations can apply it. I mean, so when I was in the M&E seat in Nairobi, I was just saying, where's the rating? Have you used this in developing your contract with the consultant, so the consultant knows that they're expected to achieve satisfactory results in each of those areas? Did you put that in with the initial contract, that kind of thing? And then if they sent it in without it, then I said sort of say, well, do the ratings and that kind of thing. So that's how we did have, sort of, it can also be part of a national evaluation policy. And that would be one of the interesting developments going forward, is to see, as countries are developing national evaluation policies, which is a big thrust of the AfrEA now, how often some version of the African evaluation guidelines, a national version, gets included in that. But according to the 2002 African Evaluation Conference plenary, it has already been decided that members of the AfrEA should be using the African evaluation guidelines for all of the evaluations that they do in Africa. And that was decided, more like unanimously by the plenary session.
Thank you, Mahesh. We have two more questions here. By the way, the chairman's job is seating the speakers. The last two speakers who spoke and their chairs have disappeared. So whoever has taken their chairs, you can yield them. I noticed that Donna and Mahesh don't have seats anymore. Okay. Nick.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation, and I'm going to actually say something about Donna as well. And I've been following both topics closely, and I think it's fascinating. But I'm having a little bit of a hard time understanding what's African about both the competencies and the standards. And I can see first that there's huge, I don't know how to say that in English, differences between among the African countries. And perhaps many African countries are going to have more similarities with Asian countries or with Latin American countries than they would have among each other. So I think first, just to, if you have thoughts about what could be more pan-African about this, but second, how can we build links that we can start having more specific competencies for fragile conflict states, or different types of CADs that are not necessarily regional or language-based, but really are more context-specific in terms that define the level of development of a country or the type of issues that they are facing.
Thank you. These are big questions.
Mr. Williams from South Africa. Mahesh, thank you for the presentation. First, small question, why present the 2002 version? The 2007 version is available and has gone through a very big process of acceptance. Second, more important question, AfrEA's strategic plan says in AfrEA that AfrEA needs to promote evaluation culture and ethics. One of the things that they said that they will do is AfrEA further improves African evaluation guidelines. I don't think they've done that very well. What's your suggestions how we can improve it? Why I'm saying it's not being done very well. Samia, as a member of AfrEA, decided that all members, when they sign up to become a member of Samia, needs to tick a box saying yes, they agree with the AfrEA guidelines. But at a conference, two conferences ago, when I engaged the session of evaluators, I'm interested in the issue of standards. When I engaged the session of fellow South African evaluators who tick these boxes because they are members of SAMIA, none of them knew about them. So what is your suggestion practically for making sure that AfrEA can deliver on improving and the second one, creating an awareness about these guidelines?
Can you be very brief, Mahesh? Just a couple of bullets on these points.
I put the question of defining Africa as a single cultural entity from Somalia to the tip of South Africa back to people who are wiser than myself. And I'm sure the person who asked the question will be one of the leaders in developing this answer. The 2007 guidelines, I could not find any substantive difference between them and the 2002 guidelines. The wording in the article was different, the wording in the changes of the actual standards was unchanged. So the actual original information source for that is the 2002, it was just republished. Is there a strategic plan of the AfrEA? I am desperate for someone to come and take this. I don't want the AfrEA back again. I don't want the PES back again. This was my gift. Anybody is welcome. Please, please, please. Take it and run with it. It's a lot of fun and there's a lot of traction, and you'll be invited to all sorts of interesting television shows to give it. Well, what do you think about guidelines? As for getting them implemented, as the problem with SAMIA is, it basically, I think it requires someone who is in a position of authority over some group, no matter however small, just to say, including just one's own self, and say any evaluation that comes out from this group or person will have that one-page summary tick sheet that says, yes, this was in compliance with the guidelines. It doesn't require more than that. It's a one-table matrix. That box is ticked. That's pretty much typical. That's where, from 2002, we are sort of raising the issue all the time. There's obviously an intense concern with it, but making that transition to actually doing something is very demanding. I mean, I left in 2003, so it's been very interesting work.
Thank you so much indeed. Very happy. You must be fair to the final speaker.
There was a question for Donna.
Big hand. Mahesh, your chair is there. Donna, you have a chair. And there's one other chair that's got to be relinquished. Somebody's taken Donna's chair.
That's right, that's right.
Okay, well, then we can use that when she's presenting, okay? And so the final presenter, thank you for your patience, Davi, is from South Africa also, and is at Wits University, so another outstanding university on the continent, and also somebody with a background in management, I think. Is that right, you said? So, and member of SUNYAP also. So please go ahead, you have the floor.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you very everyone here. I think this presentation is the intention is basically how do we create a conceptual and kind of framework. Evaluation is evaluation. This is not a new evaluation, but there are certain issues that are taking place in Africa. The context here is that I've looked at 3 countries: South Africa, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe. In South Africa, we've got, which is legislated, is the broad-based black economic empowerment. Nigeria has Nigeria, which is the federal government, national economic empowerment, which is very much aligned aligned to the national development plan at a federal government. Zimbabwe as well, it has a legislative piece titled, I think it's Zimbabwe Economic Empowerment and Indigenization, something like that, was legislated back in 2007. And what is common of these 3 countries, I mean, that was when the democracy was emerging, and even the citizens were saying, as much as we've got the political rights, what's about the economic benefit of the very political democracy that was in. And I think when we talk about economic empowerment, it's rooted there, transformation, power, and empowerment. So it's very much different to what the welfare development or so. And the other thing about this kind of interventions is that as much as the 2 countries have legislated them, the implementers or delivery of those objectives and intentions are institutions outside government, that is private sector, so to say, or government businesses in different sectors. I think in creating, looking at what then it's this conceptual analytical framework, it's more about how then do we better create or conceptualize evaluations, design, and management that really consider economic empowerment, whereby transformation, power, empowerment are very much evident. So looking at what are the kind of practices that we say, it is not this evaluation, as I said, it's not a new concept. It does function within evaluation framework or processes that are there, but it is a concept that basically it is an approach that is very concerned about or responsive to economic empowerment issues in that particular state, and as I said, it's a context driven to understand what are the political or socio-economic dynamics that are there, and also it very much requires to be driven, or demand thereof must be coming from government. What governments have done, they've drawn out this legislation, but the evaluation of them is very much behind it, and we don't hear much. And I think through this forum is to be saying, as much as we pick up maybe from different medias or various outcomes, that there isn't much of progress, and says in this field of evaluation, how best can we actually support that there is quantitative and qualitative evaluation through which to say, yes, indeed, this kind of interventions are bringing forth that which is. In South Africa, issue of demand of evaluation, it is institutionalized. The department is set up, and in other countries, I would not speak. The demand is not much. Let me be very polite, at infancy level. I think Donna has touched, if you look at what extent is South Africa has institutionalized the demand for evaluation. But even in South Africa, the evaluation of economic empowerment has not been upfront. And our government has acknowledged that there is a need of coming up with an evaluation framework of their own economic empowerment. So they've made changes in late October last year, and that they are actually looking forward to say how best, whatever we have in place, it's more about compliance, but compliance, it doesn't give much on the evaluation side. The other thing is that when one look at, I mean for me personally, evaluation is not just about commission, is that there's been some, within the social science arena, there's been some videos of what's happening in the arena of economic development, economic transformation. And also, that on its own, I think it's a starting point. It's not that we haven't done, and those kind of in Africa dates back to say, from the colonial era, in the democracy era, what is emerging, and the methods that are used, obviously it's mixed methods that we are finding, and different countries, they use different terms. Maybe I think of relations between these countries. The word economic empowerment is common, and other countries, they still speak of indigenization, so to say. The very, intervention are legislated. Obviously, there are different schools, should we legislate or should not that. The other thing about them, you've got you need evaluation level, you have it at interventions level, that is projects or program. There's also evaluation at sector level. What does it mean? What are the intervention at sector level? The execution of the very economic empowerment is very slow, or it's non-existent, so to say. And it's integral to what is, when we talk in the South African context, I would then say the BBBE, it conceptualized for us what do you mean by economic development. And even in the Nigerian case, it tells you what does it mean by economic development. It's different to, other kind of development. I try to make that difference to stand out. And transformation, in a sense, is that I would then also elaborate to say, you are looking at, it's economic empowerment, basically, in a sense, is one of the means through which economic growth is distributed. And the best way to look at as well how economy is distributed, look at different sectors that a country has prioritized to drive the growth. And in that, what is happening there, in terms of the locals or the nationals or the indigenous, are they actually main players or are they periphery players? And evaluation, to what extent is it contributing to ensure that the development in that field is actually evident, and it's about creating new industries. It's not just about ending up with so many hawkers on the street. It's about what are the new industries are we creating? What are the emerging sub-industries, so to say? And the other thing is that when looking at that evaluation, the indicators or possible indicators, I mean, you are not yet empowered if that very economic asset you do not own, and you can own and not have control. That is, decision making. Can you sow it? We say, let's move this into maybe other Arab countries or China or so. That's a power of decision making. And also, the other thing is about competent operations of these assets. If you don't have competencies to use, you're still not empowered. And the use of it, who has the use? I mean, like in the South, the major thing, and I know in Nigeria, is the issue of oil and the local community.